Marcus Thompson was a man who carried himself with a quiet confidence that came from years of hard work, determination, and resilience. He wasn't someone you'd notice right away in a crowd, no flashy clothes or loud personality, but there was something about him that made people take a second look. Maybe it was the way he held his head high, even when life threw its toughest challenges at him. Or maybe it was the warmth in his smile, the kind that could light up an entire room without saying a word. On this particular Saturday afternoon, Marcus decided to step away from his usual whirlwind of meetings and phone calls. Owning several successful restaurants across the city under his chain, Soulful Bites, kept him busy almost every waking moment. But today, he wanted to slow down, just a little. He needed some time for himself, a chance to recharge before diving back into the world of entrepreneurship. So he chose one of his favorite local spots, a small diner tucked away on a quiet street corner. It wasn't fancy, but it had charm. The kind of place where the coffee smelled like home and the burgers tasted like they were cooked with love. As Marcus pulled into the parking lot, he glanced at himself in the rearview mirror. His reflection stared back, a man in his mid-30s, dressed casually in jeans and a simple polo shirt. Nothing about his appearance screamed, wealthy businessman, and that's exactly how Marcus liked it. He didn't need expensive watches or tailored suits to feel important. What mattered most to him was the legacy he was building through Soulful Bites, a chain of restaurants known not only for their delicious food, but also for their commitment to community and inclusivity. The diner wasn't far from his office, which made it convenient for quick visits. Over the years, Marcus had grown fond of the place. He appreciated the cozy atmosphere, the friendly staff, and the fact that no matter how busy things got outside those walls, stepping inside always felt like coming home. Today, though, there was another reason he'd chosen this spot. A new menu item had caught his eye during his last visit, a special chili burger topped with caramelized onions and jalapenos, and he couldn't wait to try it again. Walking toward the entrance, Marcus pushed open the glass door with a soft jingle from the bell above. The familiar scent of sizzling meat and fresh-baked bread greeted him instantly. Inside, the diner buzzed with activity. Waitresses weaved between tables carrying trays laden with plates of steaming food. Regular patrons chatted animatedly over cups of coffee while families laughed together in cozy booths. Everything seemed normal, exactly as Marcus remembered it. He approached the counter, ready to place his order. Behind it stood a middle-aged woman wearing a crisp uniform and a name tag that read, Susan, Manager. She glanced up briefly as Marcus stepped closer, her lips curling into what might have been intended as a polite smile. But something about her expression felt off. Her eyes flickered over him quickly, taking in his casual attire and dark skin, before settling on something else entirely. For a split second, Marcus thought he saw hesitation flash across her face. Then she spoke. "Can I help you?" Susan asked, her tone clipped and distant. Marcus nodded politely. "Yes, ma'am. I'd like to order the chili burger with extra jalapenos, please." Instead of reaching for the order pad like Marcus expected, Susan crossed her arms over her chest and leaned back slightly. Her posture stiffened and her smile faded completely. The change in her demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. Something wasn't right. "I'm sorry," she said after a long pause, her voice colder now. "We're not serving anyone who looks like you today." The words landed like a punch to the gut. Marcus froze, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Had she really just said what he thought she did? He blinked once, twice, trying to process the absurdity of the situation. Surely he must have misunderstood. This was a public establishment after all. Places like this weren't supposed to turn people away based on the color of their skin. Not anymore, not in this day and age. "Excuse me?" Marcus replied, his voice calm despite the storm brewing inside him. "What do you mean?" Susan shifted uncomfortably, avoiding direct eye contact. "You heard me," she muttered under her breath. "We don't serve your kind here." The finality in her tone left no room for misinterpretation. Marcus felt anger rising within him, hot and sharp, but he forced himself to stay composed. Losing his temper wouldn't solve anything. It never did. Instead, he took a deep breath and tried one more time. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm just here to grab lunch, that's all." Susan shook her head firmly, her jaw set in defiance. "There's no misunderstanding. We have policies in place, and you're not welcome here." Her words hung heavy in the air, cutting through the hum of conversation around them. Nearby customers began to notice the tension unfolding at the counter. Some turned their heads curiously. Others pretended not to see anything at all. No one intervened. No one said a word. For a moment, Marcus considered arguing further. After all, this was blatant discrimination, plain and simple. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't make a difference. People like Susan didn't change their minds because of logic or reason. They clung to their biases out of fear or ignorance. Fighting with her would only escalate the situation, and Marcus had no desire to cause a scene. Besides, he had bigger plans for dealing with this kind of prejudice, plans that didn't involve shouting matches or empty threats. Without another word, Marcus stepped back from the counter and turned toward the exit. As he walked out of the diner, he could feel the weight of Susan's glare boring into his back. The cool autumn breeze hit his face as he stepped outside, offering a brief reprieve from the suffocating atmosphere inside. Leaning against the wall, Marcus closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. He replayed the incident in his mind, each detail burning itself into his memory. It wasn't the first time Marcus had faced racism in his life. Growing up, he'd endured countless microaggressions and outright insults simply because of the color of his skin, but somehow this felt different. This wasn't just a random stranger hurling hateful words from across the street. This was a manager of a public business denying him service based solely on his appearance. It was infuriating, yes, but it was also deeply saddening. In 2023, shouldn't humanity be past this? Despite the anger bubbling inside him, Marcus refused to let bitterness consume him. He'd learned long ago that holding on to resentment only hurt the person carrying it. Instead, he focused on finding a solution. There had to be a way to turn this negative experience into something positive, something meaningful. And as he stood there leaning against the diner's brick wall, an idea began to form. It wasn't fully fleshed out yet, but it was enough to spark a sense of purpose within him. Little did Susan know her actions that day would set off a chain of events she could never have anticipated. Marcus wasn't just any customer walking through her doors. He was a man with resources, influence, and a vision for creating real change. And soon, she would discover exactly who he was, and why dismissing him so callously had been the biggest mistake of her life. As Marcus stood outside the diner leaning against the cold brick wall, his mind raced with a mix of emotions: anger, disbelief, and even a hint of sadness. The encounter inside had been brief, but left an indelible mark on him. He replayed Susan's words over and over in his head. "We don't serve your kind here." Those 7 words echoed like a cruel refrain, each syllable heavy with prejudice and disdain. Marcus couldn't help but wonder what she meant by "your kind." Was it the color of his skin, his casual clothes, or simply the fact that he didn't fit into whatever narrow definition of acceptable customers Susan had constructed in her mind? The truth was, Marcus wasn't unfamiliar with racism or discrimination. Growing up as a black man in America, he'd faced his share of slurs, suspicious glances, and outright hostility. But this felt different. This wasn't some random stranger hurling insults from across the street. This was a manager, a person in a position of authority, publicly refusing to serve him in a place meant for everyone. It wasn't just personal, it was systemic. And that realization stung far more than any individual insult ever could. Still, Marcus refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, he allowed himself a few moments to process the situation. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and reminded himself of something his grandmother used to say: "Honey, when people show you who they are, believe them the first time." Susan had shown him exactly who she was: a prejudiced, small-minded individual who judged others based on superficial traits rather than their character. There was no point in arguing with someone like that. People like Susan weren't swayed by logic or kindness. They clung to their biases because it gave them a false sense of control in a world they didn't fully understand. With his resolve hardened, Marcus straightened up and brushed imaginary dust off his jeans. He knew he couldn't change Susan's mind today, but he also knew he wasn't powerless. In fact, this incident might present an opportunity, an unexpected chance to make a difference. As the owner of Soulful Bites, Marcus had spent years building a brand rooted in inclusivity and community. He believed deeply in using his success not just for personal gain but for uplifting others. If Susan thought she could dismiss him so easily, then she clearly had no idea who she was dealing with. Determined to turn this negative experience into something meaningful, Marcus decided to dig deeper. Later that evening, after returning home and eating a quiet dinner, a grilled chicken sandwich hastily thrown together, he sat down at his desk and opened his laptop. For the next hour, he scoured the internet for information about the diner. Who owned it? How long had it been operating? What did its financials look like? Marcus prided himself on being thorough, and he wanted to know everything before making his next move. What he discovered shocked him, but not entirely. The diner, it turned out, was struggling. Despite its prime location and cozy charm, business had been steadily declining over the past few years. Online reviews painted a mixed picture. Some praised the food and service, while others complained about poor management and outdated practices. A quick search of public records revealed that the diner was barely breaking even, surviving month to month on razor-thin margins. It seemed clear that Susan's refusal to serve certain customers wasn't just about bigotry, it was also about desperation. Perhaps she believed turning away undesirable patrons would somehow protect her fragile little empire. In reality, her actions were only hastening its demise. Armed with this knowledge, Marcus began formulating a plan. He didn't want revenge or to see the diner fail. Instead, he envisioned something bigger, a chance to teach Susan and others like her a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. After all, hatred and ignorance thrived in silence, but exposure and education could dismantle them piece by piece. By Monday morning, Marcus had mapped out his strategy. He called his assistant, Michelle, and asked her to prepare documents related to potential partnerships and acquisitions. Then, he scheduled a meeting with his team to discuss logistics. By the end of the week, everything would be ready for his return to the diner. When Friday rolled around, Marcus arrived at the diner once again. But this time, things were different. He wasn't alone. Accompanying him were two colleagues dressed in sharp suits, carrying clipboards and folders filled with paperwork. They looked every bit the part of corporate professionals, exuding confidence and purpose. Marcus himself opted for a slightly more formal outfit: khakis, a button-down shirt, and polished loafers. If Susan thought she could intimidate him with her bias, she was about to learn otherwise. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was much the same as before. Waitresses bustling between tables, patrons chatting over plates of food. But when Marcus walked through the door, the energy shifted almost immediately. Heads turned, whispers spread, and soon all eyes were on him. Susan, standing behind the counter, froze mid-conversation with a customer. Her face went pale as recognition dawned. She recognized him instantly, the man she'd turned away just days earlier. Only now he wasn't coming in alone or casually dressed. Something about his demeanor screamed authority, and Susan knew instinctively that trouble was brewing. Marcus approached the counter with deliberate steps, his expression calm but unreadable. When he reached Susan, he offered a polite nod and introduced himself formally. "Hello," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "I'm Marcus Thompson, owner of Soulful Bites. We're interested in discussing potential opportunities to collaborate, or possibly acquire, this establishment." For a moment, Susan just stared at him, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. Clearly, she hadn't expected this. Of all the scenarios she might have imagined upon seeing Marcus again, this wasn't one of them. Her initial shock quickly gave way to panic as the weight of her earlier actions crashed down on her. Here was the man she'd dismissed so cruelly, standing before her not as just another customer, but as someone with power, influence, and resources. And worse still, he was offering her a lifeline, a chance to save the failing diner she clearly cared about. But Marcus wasn't done yet. Without waiting for a response, he gestured to his colleagues, who began laying out documents and brochures on the counter. "We've done our research," Marcus continued, his tone firm but measured. "Your diner has potential, but it's struggling. With the right investment and leadership, it could thrive again. However, we operate under very specific values. Values centered on inclusivity, respect, and community. If we're going to work together, those principles will need to guide everything moving forward." Susan stood there, overwhelmed and speechless. Tears welled up in her eyes as the enormity of her mistake sank in. She realized too late that her prejudice hadn't just hurt Marcus, it had endangered the very thing she was trying to protect. Now, faced with the possibility of redemption, she had no choice but to confront the ugliness of her own actions. As Marcus watched her struggle with her emotions, he felt a pang of sympathy. He didn't enjoy seeing anyone humiliated, not even someone who had treated him so poorly. But he also knew that growth often came through discomfort. If Susan was willing to learn from this experience, if she was willing to change, then maybe there was hope for her yet. And perhaps, just perhaps, this diner could become more than just a place to eat. It could become a symbol of transformation, proof that even the deepest wounds could heal with time and effort. For now, though, Marcus remained focused. This wasn't about vengeance or punishment, it was about planting seeds of change. And as he stood there, watching Susan grapple with the consequences of her choices, he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Sometimes, the best way to fight hate wasn't with anger or retaliation, it was with grace, patience, and a willingness to lead by example. The air inside the diner felt thick with tension as Marcus stood at the counter, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around him. Susan, the manager, looked like someone who had just been caught in the act of something shameful. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. Tears streamed down her face, leaving streaks of mascara trailing down her cheeks. The weight of her earlier actions, the cruel dismissal, the blatant discrimination was crushing her in real time. For a moment, no one spoke. The diner's usual hum of conversation faded into an eerie silence, broken only by the faint clinking of silverware against plates and the occasional squeak of shoes on the tiled floor. Patrons glanced nervously between Marcus and Susan, unsure whether they should stay or leave. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats while others leaned forward, eager to witness what would happen next. It was clear that this wasn't just another ordinary day at the diner, it was a reckoning. Finally, unable to bear the pressure any longer, Susan dropped to her knees in front of Marcus. Her voice cracked as she began to plead. "Please forgive me," she sobbed, her words tumbling out in a jumbled rush. I didn't mean, please give me another chance." Her display of vulnerability caught Marcus off guard. He hadn't expected her to react this way, not so openly, not so desperately. For all his preparation and planning, he hadn't anticipated the raw emotion now spilling out of Susan. Part of him wanted to turn away, to shield himself from the discomfort of watching someone unravel before his eyes. But another part of him, a deeper, more compassionate part, felt a flicker of empathy. Despite everything, he recognized that Susan was human, flawed, and frightened, much like anyone else. Marcus took a step back, giving her space to compose herself. Then, after a long pause, he extended his hand toward her. Slowly, hesitantly, Susan reached up and grasped it, allowing him to help her stand. Once she was on her feet again, Marcus met her gaze directly. His expression softened, but his voice remained firm. "This isn't about revenge," he said, his tone measured yet kind. "What you did to me was wrong, yes, but holding on to hate won't fix anything. What matters now is understanding and deciding whether you're willing to change." Susan nodded vigorously, tears still streaming down her face. "I am," she whispered, almost choking on the words. I'll do whatever it takes. Just, please don't shut us down. Marcus studied her for a moment, searching for sincerity in her tearful apology. He knew better than to trust empty promises or hollow gestures. People often said what they thought others wanted to hear when backed into a corner. But true change required more than words. It demanded action, accountability, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Still, there was something genuine in Susan's plea, something fragile but earnest, that gave Marcus hope. You judged me based on how I look, Marcus continued, his voice steady. Not who I am. That kind of thinking doesn't just hurt people, it destroys businesses and communities. If we're going to move forward, you need to understand why what you did was wrong and commit to doing better. Susan nodded again, wiping her face with trembling hands. I swear I'll learn, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll make sure this never happens again. With that, Marcus signaled to his colleagues, who stepped forward with folders filled with documents. They laid them out on the counter, explaining the terms of the proposed partnership. Soulful Bites would invest in the diner, providing the financial support it desperately needed to stay afloat. In return, Susan would oversee daily operations, but with one crucial condition. She would undergo mandatory training on diversity, inclusion, and equitable practices. Additionally, Marcus insisted that she issue a public apology, acknowledging her mistake and outlining steps she intended to take to prevent such incidents in the future. The idea of issuing a public apology made Susan visibly uneasy. She squirmed under Marcus's gaze, clearly uncomfortable with the prospect of admitting her wrongdoing in front of strangers. But Marcus didn't budge. Accountability is key, he explained gently but firmly. It's not enough to say, sorry behind closed doors. You have to show the world that you're serious about change. Reluctantly, Susan agreed. Over the next few days, Marcus worked closely with her to draft the apology, ensuring it struck the right balance between humility and commitment. When it was finally ready, Susan posted it on social media, read it aloud during staff meetings, and even taped a printed copy to the diner's front window for all to see. Each time she shared the message, her voice wavered with nerves, but she persevered, knowing it was a necessary step toward redemption. In the weeks that followed, the diner underwent a transformation, not just in its appearance, but in its culture. Marcus brought in consultants to train the staff on inclusivity and customer service, emphasizing the importance of treating every guest with dignity and respect. New menu items inspired by Soulful Bites were introduced, drawing in crowds eager to try dishes infused with bold flavors and cultural influences. Bright murals depicting themes of unity and diversity adorned the walls, creating a warm and welcoming atmosphere. Even the name of the diner changed, becoming Harmony Diner, a nod to its renewed mission of fostering connection and understanding. Through it all, Susan remained deeply involved, working tirelessly to prove that she was committed to change. She attended workshops, read books on racial equity, and actively sought feedback from customers and employees alike. At first, some patrons were skeptical, questioning whether her apology was sincere or simply a PR stunt. But over time, as they witnessed her efforts firsthand, many began to soften their stance. Slowly but surely, Susan earned back a measure of trust, not through grand gestures, but through consistent, genuine behavior. For Marcus, the entire experience reinforced his belief in the power of forgiveness and second chances. He had entered the situation intending to teach a lesson, but along the way he learned something too, that even those who perpetuate harm can grow if given the opportunity. Of course, forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. Marcus knew that Susan's actions had consequences both for herself and for others, but he also believed that punishing her endlessly wouldn't bring about meaningful change. Instead, by offering her a path forward, he hoped to inspire growth, not just in Susan but in everyone connected to the diner. As months passed, Harmony Diner became more than just a place to grab a meal. It evolved into a hub of positivity and progress, attracting visitors from all walks of life. Families gathered there for Sunday brunches, students studied at its cozy booths, and community groups held meetings in its newly renovated event space. The diner's success served as a testament to the idea that adversity, when faced with courage and compassion, could lead to renewal. Looking back on the journey, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not just in what he'd accomplished, but in the ripple effect it created. By choosing grace over vengeance, he had sparked a chain reaction of healing and transformation. And though he knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, for Susan, for the diner, or for society as a whole, he remained optimistic. After all, real change rarely happened overnight. It was messy, imperfect, and often painful. But it was also possible, and worth fighting for. Standing outside Harmony Diner one sunny afternoon, Marcus watched as customers streamed in and out, laughing and chatting as they enjoyed their meals. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to savor the victory, not just his own, but the collective triumph of everyone who had played a part in rewriting the diner's story. Then, with a quiet smile, he turned and walked away, ready to tackle whatever challenge came next. Later that evening, after Marcus left the diner for the second time, this time with a plan brewing in his mind, he sat at his desk, staring at the glowing screen of his laptop. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan, spinning lazily above him. Outside, the city buzzed with life, but inside, Marcus's focus was razor sharp. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was determined. Determined to turn what had been a painful and humiliating experience into something meaningful, something transformative. He started by doing what he did best: research. Marcus knew that understanding the problem fully was the first step toward solving it. So, he began digging into the diner's history. Who owned it? How long had it been operating? What were its financials like? These weren't idle questions. They were crucial pieces of information that would help Marcus decide how to proceed. As someone who had built Soulful Bites from the ground up, Marcus understood the importance of strategy. You couldn't just walk into a situation blindly. You needed data, context, and a clear vision. The more he searched, the clearer the picture became. The diner had been around for decades, passed down through generations of the same family. At one point, it had thrived as a neighborhood staple, known for its hearty meals and friendly atmosphere. But over the years, things had changed. New restaurants popped up nearby, offering trendy menus and Instagram-worthy decor. The diner, meanwhile, remained stuck in the past, clinging to outdated practices and failing to adapt to the times. Its customer base dwindled, and its finances grew increasingly precarious. By the time Susan took over as manager, the diner was barely surviving, scraping by month to month on meager profits. What struck Marcus most, however, wasn't just the diner's decline. It was the desperation behind Susan's actions. Refusing. Service to someone based on their race wasn't just racist, it was also short-sighted. In her misguided attempt to protect the diner, Susan had alienated potential customers, tarnished its reputation, and driven away business. Her prejudice wasn't just morally wrong, it was bad for the bottom line. And yet Marcus suspected there was more to her behavior than simple bigotry. People rarely acted out of pure malice. Often fear or ignorance played a role. Susan's actions likely stemmed from a combination of both, a toxic mix of misplaced pride and financial insecurity. As Marcus pieced together the diner's story, an idea began to form in his mind. It wasn't enough to call out Susan for her mistake or demand justice through legal means. While those steps might satisfy his initial anger, they wouldn't address the root cause of the problem. Instead, Marcus envisioned something bigger, a chance to create lasting change, not just for the diner but for the community as a whole. If he could find a way to work with Susan instead of against her, maybe he could teach her and others like her a valuable lesson about inclusivity, empathy, and the power of diversity. By Monday morning, Marcus had mapped out his strategy. He called Michelle, his trusted assistant, and asked her to prepare documents related to partnerships and acquisitions. Then, he scheduled a meeting with his team to discuss logistics. Over the next few days, they worked tirelessly, drafting proposals, reviewing financial projections, and brainstorming ideas for revitalizing the diner. Marcus even reached out to a few contacts in the hospitality industry, seeking advice on how to transform a struggling establishment into a thriving one. By Friday, everything was ready. All that remained was to return to the diner and present his plan. When Marcus arrived at the diner later that week, he wasn't alone. Accompanying him were two colleagues dressed in sharp suits, carrying clipboards, and folders filled with paperwork. They looked every bit the part of corporate professionals, exuding confidence and purpose. Marcus himself opted for a slightly more formal outfit: khakis, a button-down shirt, and polished loafers. Gone was the casual demeanor of his previous visit. This time he radiated authority, leaving no doubt that he meant business. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was much the same as before. Waitresses bustling between tables, patrons chatting over plates of food. But when Marcus walked through the door, the energy shifted almost immediately. Heads turned, whispers spread, and soon all eyes were on him. Susan, standing behind the counter, froze mid-conversation with a customer. Her face went pale as recognition dawned. She recognized him instantly, the man she'd turned away so cruelly just days earlier. Only now he wasn't coming in alone or casually dressed. Something about his demeanor screamed authority, and Susan knew instinctively that trouble was brewing. Marcus approached the counter with deliberate steps, his expression calm but unreadable. When he reached Susan, he offered a polite nod and introduced himself formally. "Hello," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "I'm Marcus Thompson, owner of Soulful Bites. We're interested in discussing potential opportunities to collaborate, or possibly acquire, this establishment." For a moment, Susan just stared at him, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. Clearly, she hadn't expected this. Of all the scenarios she might have imagined upon seeing Marcus again, this wasn't one of them. Her initial shock quickly gave way to panic as the weight of her earlier actions crashed down on her. Here was the man she'd dismissed so cruelly, standing before her not as just another customer, but as someone with power, influence, and resources. And worse still, he was offering her a lifeline, a chance to save the failing diner she clearly cared about. But Marcus wasn't done yet. Without waiting for a response, he gestured to his colleagues, who began laying out documents and brochures on the counter. "We've done our research," Marcus continued, his tone firm but measured. "Your diner has potential, but it's struggling. With the right investment and leadership, it could thrive again. However, we operate under very specific values. Values centered on inclusivity, respect, and community. If we're going to work together, those principles will need to guide everything moving forward." Susan stood there overwhelmed and speechless. Tears welled up in her eyes as the enormity of her mistake sank in. She realized too late that her prejudice hadn't just hurt Marcus. It had endangered the very thing she was trying to protect. Now faced with the possibility of redemption, she had no choice but to confront the ugliness of her own actions. As Marcus watched her struggle with her emotions, he felt a pang of sympathy. He didn't enjoy seeing anyone humiliated, not even someone who had treated him so poorly. But he also knew that growth often came through discomfort. If Susan was willing to learn from this experience, if she was willing to change, then maybe there was hope for her yet. And perhaps, just perhaps, this diner could become more than just a place to eat. It could become a symbol of transformation. Proof that even the deepest wounds could heal with time and effort. For now, though, Marcus remained focused. This wasn't about vengeance or punishment. It was about planting seeds of change. And as he stood there, watching Susan grapple with the consequences of her choices, he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Sometimes, the best way to fight hate wasn't with anger or retaliation. It was with grace, patience, and a willingness to lead by example. With that thought in mind, Marcus signaled to his colleagues to wrap up their presentation. Together they outlined the next steps: training sessions for the staff, renovations to modernize the space, and marketing campaigns to attract new customers. Susan listened intently, nodding along as tears continued to stream down her face. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could undo the damage she had caused, not just to Marcus, but to the diner and the community it served. As the meeting drew to a close, Marcus extended his hand once again. This time, Susan shook it firmly, her grip steadier than before. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down." Marcus smiled faintly, his expression softening. "It's not me you need to prove yourself to," he replied gently. "It's everyone who walks through those doors." And with that, the journey toward redemption began, not just for Susan, but for the diner itself. The moment Marcus extended his hand to Susan, the atmosphere in the diner shifted once again. The tension that had been hanging thick in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a fragile but palpable sense of possibility. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. For Susan, this handshake felt like more than just a gesture of goodwill. It was a lifeline thrown to her when she least expected it. She clung to it desperately, knowing deep down that this might be her only chance to make things right. As Marcus and his team wrapped up their presentation, Susan found herself overwhelmed with conflicting emotions: relief, shame, gratitude, and fear all swirling together in an exhausting storm. On one hand, she couldn't believe what was happening. Just days ago, she had dismissed Marcus without a second thought, treating him as though he were unworthy of even stepping foot inside her diner. Now here he was, offering her not just a partnership but a path toward redemption. On the other hand, the enormity of her mistake weighed heavily on her shoulders. How could she ever undo the harm she had caused? Could she really rebuild trust after such blatant prejudice? Marcus seemed to sense her turmoil. As the meeting concluded, he pulled up a chair at one of the nearby tables, motioning for Susan to join him. His colleagues excused themselves politely, leaving the two of them alone to talk. For a few moments, neither spoke. Susan fidgeted nervously with the hem of her uniform, avoiding eye contact while Marcus studied her carefully. Finally, he broke the silence. "I'm not going to pretend this is easy," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "What you did to me was wrong, and it hurt, but I also know that people can change if they're willing to put in the work. This isn't just about saving your diner. It's about proving to yourself and to everyone else that you're capable of doing better." Susan nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes once again. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she admitted quietly. "I wouldn't forgive me either if I were in your shoes. All I can do is try to make things right, starting now." Her honesty surprised Marcus. He had anticipated resistance, defensiveness, maybe even denial. Instead, Susan was owning up to her actions, acknowledging the pain she had caused. It was a small step, but it was progress nonetheless. Encouraged by her response, Marcus leaned forward slightly, his tone softening. "Change starts with accountability," he explained, "and part of being accountable means facing the consequences of your choices head-on. That's why we're asking you to issue a public apology, to let the community know what happened and how you plan to prevent it from happening again. It won't be easy, but it's necessary." Susan swallowed hard, visibly bracing herself for what came next. Public apologies weren't something she'd ever considered before. In fact, the idea terrified her. Admitting her wrongdoing to strangers felt like opening herself up to ridicule and judgment. What if people refused to accept her apology? What if they saw her as irredeemable? These fears gnawed at her, threatening to derail any progress she had made so far. But Marcus didn't sugarcoat the challenge ahead. "You judged me based on how I look," he reminded her gently. "Not who I am. That kind of thinking doesn't just hurt individuals. It divides communities and perpetuates cycles of hate. If you want to move forward, you need to show people that you understand why what you did was wrong, and that you're committed to changing." Susan nodded again, her resolve strengthening despite her anxiety. "I'll do it," she promised, her voice trembling but sincere. "Whatever it takes." Over the next week, Marcus worked closely with Susan to craft the apology. Together, they drafted a statement that was both humble and heartfelt, emphasizing her remorse and outlining concrete steps she intended to take to foster inclusivity within the diner. They decided to post the apology on social media, read it aloud during staff meetings, and even display it prominently in the diner itself. Each platform served a different purpose, reaching younger audiences online, addressing employees directly, and reassuring customers who walked through the doors every day. When the time came to share the apology publicly, Susan was a bundle of nerves. On the morning of the first announcement, she stood outside the diner, clutching a printed copy of the statement and shaking hands. Her heart pounded in her chest as she imagined the reaction she might receive. Would people mock her? Ignore her? Worse yet, would they boycott the diner altogether? Despite these fears, she forced herself to stay focused. This was her responsibility, her burden to bear. Taking a deep breath, Susan stepped forward and addressed the small crowd that had gathered outside the diner. Her voice wavered at first, but as she continued reading, it grew steadier. To my community, to my customers, and especially to Mr. Marcus Thompson, she began, her gaze fixed firmly on the paper in front of her. I owe you all an apology. Last week I made a grave error in judgment. I turned away a customer solely because of the color of his skin. My actions were unacceptable, discriminatory, and deeply hurtful, not only to Mr. Thompson but to everyone who believes in equality and fairness. She paused briefly, glancing up to meet the eyes of those listening. Some looked skeptical, others curious, but most simply waited patiently for her to continue. Summoning her courage, Susan pressed on. I cannot undo the harm I caused, but I can commit to doing better. Moving forward, I will undergo training on diversity and inclusion. I will ensure that every single person who enters this diner is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, gender, or background. And I will hold myself accountable for creating a safe, welcoming environment for all. By the time she finished speaking, tears streamed freely down her face. The crowd remained silent for a beat before erupting into cautious applause. A few patrons approached her afterward, offering words of encouragement or simply nodding in approval. Others kept their distance, clearly reserving judgment until they saw tangible results. But for Susan, the response didn't matter as much as the act itself. She had taken the first step toward rebuilding trust, and that was enough. For now. Meanwhile, Marcus wasted no time implementing the changes he had proposed. Consultants arrived to train the staff on inclusive practices, teaching them how to interact respectfully with customers from diverse backgrounds. New menu items inspired by soulful bites were introduced, drawing in crowds eager to try dishes infused with bold flavors and cultural influences. Bright murals depicting themes of unity and diversity adorned the walls, creating a warm and inviting atmosphere. Even the name of the diner changed, becoming Harmony Diner, a nod to its renewed mission of fostering connection and understanding. Through it all, Susan remained deeply involved, working tirelessly to prove that she was committed to change. She attended workshops, read books on racial equity, and actively sought feedback from customers and employees alike. At first, some patrons were skeptical, questioning whether her apology was sincere or simply a PR stunt. But over time, as they witnessed her efforts firsthand, many began to soften their stance. Slowly but surely, Susan earned back a measure of trust, not through grand gestures but through consistent, genuine behavior. For Marcus, watching the transformation unfold was incredibly rewarding. He hadn't returned to the diner seeking revenge or retribution. He had come hoping to inspire growth. And in Susan, he saw the potential for real change, not just in her own life but in the lives of those around her. By choosing grace over vengeance, he had sparked a chain reaction of healing and renewal. One evening, as Marcus sat at a booth in Harmony Diner, sipping a cup of coffee and observing the bustling scene around him, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. Families laughed together at nearby tables, students huddled over textbooks in cozy corners, and elderly couples shared quiet conversations over slices of pie. The diner had become more than just a place to eat. It had become a symbol of hope, resilience, and possibility. Looking across the room, Marcus caught Susan's eye. She smiled faintly, her expression a mixture of gratitude and determination. Though the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, for Susan, for the diner, or for society as a whole, Marcus remained optimistic. Real change rarely happened overnight. It was messy, imperfect, and often painful. But it was also possible, and worth fighting for. With that thought in mind, Marcus finished his coffee, paid his bill, and slipped out into the night. Behind him, the lights of Harmony Diner glowed brightly, a beacon of progress in a world still struggling to overcome its divisions.